Greetings and welcome to Southern Connecticut State University's annual Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. celebration. My name is Diane Brown Albert, and I am the coordinator of our Multicultural Center. My sincere and warm welcome to all of you for joining us today, especially to our keynote speaker, Mr. Nyle Fort. President Joe Bertolino, Dr. Carter David, Maya York, as well as to our deans, cabinet members, students, faculty, staff, and students from Wilbur Cross High School, and all guests from our New Haven community for joining us. Each year, we gather to celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King, his legacy as a leader and a visionary for the struggle for racial justice. These annual celebrations of Dr. King's legacy are important, not simply to reflect on the life and work of a great man who led a movement that moved this nation forward, and not simply to remember Dr. King and the civil rights movement for the work that was accomplished in the fight against poverty and segregation. But each year, I hope you recommit to continue Dr. King's work as he challenged us to do our part to make America a great nation. Before we begin, I want to especially affirm that the lands on which we live and work are the original homelands of the Pawcatuck and Quinnipiac peoples. We strive to honor as well as respect the diverse Indigenous people connected to these lands with gratitude for the land itself and the people who have stewarded throughout generations. So, what's there to come? Well, today we honor Dr. King's legacy with greetings from Southern's own President, Joe Bertolino, introduction of our speaker by Maya York, who's president of our Black Student Union, and the question and answer section will be led by Dr. Carter David, professor of history, and we'll listen to a PowerPoint presentation on pandemic privilege and protest by Mr. Nyle Fort. So with no further delay, please join me in welcoming Southern's own president, Joe Bertolino.
Thank you, Diane, and I'm delighted to be here with you today. I can see that we have a large number of individuals who have joined us today, so I'm even more delighted to see that. I'd like to welcome everyone to this afternoon's event, and I'd like to thank the Multicultural Center and others for their good work. This is the first, I believe, in a series of virtual celebrations of Black history, lives, and culture that will present at Southern this month and beyond. Even as we recognize the central role of African Americans in the United States and in history, I think this is also a time for us to reflect on, to take a stand against the racial injustice, the inequality, the systematic racism that is pervasive in our society and has been laid bare by the ravages of COVID. I think that while the pandemic affects everyone, we know that it disproportionately harms Black communities with racial inequalities of medical care and wealth, employment, housing, incarceration, all of these impacting death and infection rates. So today's speaker, Nyle Fort, will not only explore these patterns of inequality, but also demonstrate how we as a caring community can respond to them as part of our campus-wide commitment to ending systematic racism and to the cause of social justice. I hope that in so doing, he will draw on the teachings of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, whose words and actions resonate now more than ever in light of racial, political, economic turmoil that our nation has endured in recent times. Dr. King's vision was that of a nation built on the strengths of its diverse peoples, of a nation that could only grow stronger by welcoming and utilizing the many gifts of its people. His legacy continues to inspire those of us who care about human dignity. Now more than ever, let us embrace his message and mission and work toward dismantling systematic racism so that equality and justice might be fully realized for all. Again, I want to thank you for participating today. I want to thank our panelists and Diane and her team for their good work today. Look forward to hearing what Mr. Fort has to say, and also I'll be very interested to hear the Q&A and what others have to share as we go through today's event and as we move forward to the others. So pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, President Joe. And now I'd like to introduce Maya York, who is the president of the Black Student Union here on campus. She'll have the honor of introducing our guest speaker.
So hello, everyone. My name is Maya York. As Diane said, I am the president of the Black Student Union. And today we have with us Mr. Nyle Fort. He is a minister, an activist, and a scholar based in New York, New Jersey. He has worked in education, criminal justice, and youth development for over a decade. After the tragic shooting and death of Michael Brown by the police officer Darrell Wilson, he traveled to Ferguson, Missouri to help build the movement for Black lives. He has won numerous fellowships, including the Ford Foundation, the Forum for Theological Exploration, and the Proverbs Office at the University of Pennsylvania. He doesn't stop there. While completing his doctoral dissertation, Nyle consults around issues of policing, student activism, faith-based organizing, and diversity and inclusion. His latest project is helping to build a National Institute for Social Justice with a world-renowned social justice scholar and writer. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Nyle Fort.
Thank you for that introduction. Hi, everybody. First and foremost, I just want to thank you all for having me today. I wish that we could be in person, but we're probably all familiar with the Zoom life now, so we'll do what we do. I'm very, very excited, and I actually want to just go ahead and get right into it because my favorite part of these conversations is the Q&A part. And so I do need to say two things before I go into my talk. They're two very, very important things. Number one, I don't know if you heard, I'm a minister, so I grew up in a Black church. I'm also a big fan of hip hop. I'm a fan of the culture. So I'm somewhere between Dr. King and Meek Mill. And if you know hip hop and if you know the Black church, that means that I believe in this thing called call and response. It would be a lot better if we were in person, but if you know what call and response is, it's very simple. It just means that we want to have some energy and some spirit in the space. So if you're listening to hip hop music, you don't just sit there like this. You're going to bop your head, you're going to bump your shoulders, you're going to do that. So I know we're on Zoom, but I encourage you to let the spirit lead you, to be fully engaged. If you want to snap your fingers, I know the young folks do that these days. If you want to clap, if you want to stomp your feet, whatever you do, if you're in your bedroom, on a street corner, in your car, just be fully engaged. We call that call and response. The other thing that's very important is that I'm the youngest of 8. And so I'm the youngest. My mom is very much, I'm very much a mama's boy. Every time I do one of these talks, and I do a lot of them, she asks me, how did they like you? And I have a Black mama and I'm a mama's boy. So I have to be honest with her. And you don't know my mama, but I know my mama, and you don't want my mama not to like you, all right? And so y'all laughing, but I'm serious. She's a little older, but she has an iPhone, and Connecticut's not that far from New Jersey. Okay, all right. So call and response, mama's boy. Hope y'all are fully engaged. I like to tell stories. So I would like to actually start my talk with a story, if that's all right with you all. As I talk, please, either mentally note or put on a notepad in your iPhone or write in the Q&A, put some questions, put some experiences, whatever comes to mind that you would like to speak about. Please, and in the back of your mind, let us remember that right here in the United States of America, we have over 450,000 people who've fallen victim to the novel coronavirus. And I can't get into it as much as I would like because I want to go ahead and get to the Q&A. But I want us to remember that while the pandemic is unprecedented, that is, we've never seen anything like this in over 100 years since the Spanish flu in the early 1900s. The pandemic is also all too familiar in its consequences. And so the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, makes this very clear. Black Americans are twice as likely to die of COVID than white Americans, and 3 times more likely to catch COVID than white Americans. And so as I go through this talk, as I talk about Dr. King, as I talk about Black history, let's also center this talk in the gravity of the moment. Okay, y'all with me? Y'all with me? All right. So I told you I like telling stories. I talked about my mom, right? So my mom told me and my brother bedtime stories every night. After long days of consoling grieving families, my mother's a mortician. I grew up in a Black funeral home, but that's for a whole nother talk. After long days of consoling grieving families, she would come home, take a bath, and around 9 o'clock, she would sneak into our room with a big smile on her face. My older brother, Chad, would jump up and down in anticipation. And being the youngest, I copied everything my brother did. So what did I do? I jumped up and down too. When my mom would get to the scary part of the story, and my brother Chad would say, "Ooh, guess what I said?" All right, some of y'all I see you call and response, some of y'all not. So I'm jotting down mental notes. I would say, "Ooh." My brother and I stayed in what we call the little room. The little room. The little room was a large closet turned makeshift bedroom next to the sun parlor. Every time it rained, the sun parlor would flood and leave a mild, nauseating stench of mildew that lingered for days. And we had 3 types of clothes. Now, I know y'all got Fendi, Louis, Prada, Gucci, all that stuff. But back in the day, you know, we had 3 types of clothes. I'm what J. Cole calls a middle child. So I'm old enough to know better, but young enough, somebody can finish that. We had 3 types of clothes. We had school clothes. We had church clothes. Somebody knew what I'm talking about. And we had play clothes. There we go. Now, if you tried to be cool and wear your play clothes to school, that would be the last game you played for a while. I know from personal experience. We wore hand-me-downs. We huddled around the stove when winter crept into the house. And we played games like Army and Manhunt. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And we had, somebody said we did too, all right. We didn't have much, but we had each other and we had stories. And there was one story that always stood out to me. My mom began it the same way every time. She would say, "Once upon a time, there were 2 princes named Chad and Nyle." My mom knew what she was doing. This was the mid-1990s, on the heels of Reaganomics and in the heat of the largest prison boom in world history. Rodney King, someone by the name of Rodney King, some of you might remember, was nearly beaten to death by the Los Angeles Police Department just 2 years after I was born. President Clinton was in the process of ending welfare as we know it, and no one in my immediate family had gotten past high school. My mom may not have had a formal analysis of the political landscape that my brother and I was born into, but she knew from the sheer experience of raising 3 Black boys what we were up against. She may not have known that the United States was on its way to incarcerating more human beings. Pay attention to this, y'all. The United States was on its way to incarcerating more human beings than any other nation in human history. We have here in the United States about 5% of the world's population, but about 25% of the world's incarcerated population. I'm not good at math. I know y'all are really good. You're at Southern Connecticut, but I'm not that good. But I think that means about 1 in every 4 people are incarcerated right here in the United States of America, the so-called land of the free. My mom didn't know about all this, but she knew what it felt like to watch one of her sons walk into a courtroom in chains. She may not have known that, at least according to one report, every 28 hours in America, a Black person is killed by a police officer or a vigilante, that is someone acting as if they are a police officer. But she knew to never let me leave the house without warning me 15, 20 times, Nyle, be careful. I just turned 31 years old and she still doesn't let me leave her house when I visit without warning me, Nyle, be careful. I doubt my mom kept up with unemployment statistics, but she knew that in our neighborhood and in so many like them, if you were young and Black and poor, then it would be easier for you to find a gun than to find a job. But in my mother's stories, we were free to dream, free to be, free to fly above the turbulent winds of racial injustice. During the day, my brother and I may have been seen as statistics in our schools, on street corners, on our television sets. But at bedtime, we were leaders in a land where everyone was free. I'm going somewhere, y'all, so y'all keep up with me. Stories matter. Stories matter. They say something about who we are and who we can become. Whether we realize it or not, stories shape how we think, how we love, how we dream, and how we see the world. Stories, more than anything, I believe, tell us what is possible. And I'm not only talking about the bedtime stories my mom would tell me and Chad every night, but these larger narratives that are told both loudly and quietly every day in our society, stories through media and through law and through education and advertisements, stories we hear in our music or at our religious institutions, even in our family. I don't know about you, but I got a crazy family, so I'll be hearing all types of stories at the Thanksgiving table. Stories that Black people are lazy, that women are not as strong as men, that all Muslims are terrorists, that being physically attractive means you must be a certain weight and skin color and have certain features, that if you are poor, it's because you didn't work hard. Stories matter. Now it's Black History Month. We're celebrating Dr. King. The story we tell about Dr. King matters. Not only because we want to get the facts straight, we are in institutions of higher education. We come so that we can understand history in light of our present moment. But the story we tell about Dr. King matters not simply because we want to get the facts straight, but because King's legacy is not primarily about the past. It's really a contest over the future. That means that King's story is more than King's story, it's our story too. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel put it this way: the whole future of America will depend on the impact and influence of Dr. King. Now, I know y'all go, like I said, to this great university and you understand all the radical elements of King, but I grew up in a little public school, so the story I learned of King was something like a lullaby. A lullaby. The mainstream, the popular story of Dr. King is a lullaby. A song intended to keep us asleep. The King I was taught in public schools was something like Santa Claus, a magical figure who came around once a year to confirm all of our national illusions and fantasies. The idea that we live in a land of liberty and justice for all. The idea that we are a beacon of democracy throughout the world. But the mythical King is far from the historical King. America's most famous preacher was much more than the 4-word sentence we know him for. What's the 4-word sentence? Y'all know it. I have a dream. King not only had a dream, but he asked certain basic questions about American society. Like, quote, what good is having the right to sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford to buy a hamburger? Dr. King asked simple but important questions like, quote, why are there 40 million poor people in America, the richest nation on earth? King cared about much more than just racial justice. He was deeply concerned with what he called the triple evils of racism, militarism, and poverty. He pushed for universal employment for all people. He critiqued the war in Vietnam when it was unpopular and dangerous to do so. He launched a poor people's campaign. The FBI called him, quote, the most dangerous man in America. And by the end of his life, 72% of white Americans and even 55% of Black Americans disapproved of Dr. King's efforts to end the war and to eradicate poverty. Now, this may be hard to believe, But our beloved king died unpopular and heartbroken. He suffered depression, and just days before his assassination, he asked his friend and famous actor Harry Belafonte, "Are we integrating into a burning house?" Still, King never lost hope in the possibility, not the inevitability, but the possibility of transforming society. You know, he was a preacher like me, so it was always some good news, but you got to go through the bad news to get through the good news. You got to dream out of a nightmare. We often like to jump over the nightmare in order to get to the dream, but King's dream was born through a nightmare. He believed in the possibility of transforming society. He died calling for a revolution of values. He understood that social change involves ethical formation. That is, transforming ourselves from the inside as much as it does political struggle. He knew what I learned in Sunday school, that we cannot remake society without transforming ourselves, and that we cannot transform ourselves without remaking society. For King, revolutionary struggle is not simply a matter of politics, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, a liberal or a conservative, as if those are our only options, by the way, but that's for another talk. For King, it's what he learned in Sunday school, that all of God's children matter. Now, if we want to complete and not merely commemorate King's dream, if we want to complete and not merely celebrate King's dream, we got to break free from the same old tired story we've been telling ourselves. Y'all still with me? All right. You know that story, that things are bad, but they're always getting better. That we've come a long way, but still have a long way to go, which of course tells us nothing about where it is that we're going. We have to let go of comforting lies and face certain terrifying facts, that there are over 2 million Americans locked up in our prisons, jails, and juvenile detention centers, and another 5 million under carceral control. Now, I'm not telling you this simply because I read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, or because I perused Naomi Mirakawa's The First Civil Right, or because I understand the arguments in Louis Waquant's Punishing the Poor. I'm telling you this because I have a nephew who spent his last 3 birthdays in a cage, essentially for being young, Black, poor, growing up on the wrong street and having a bad day. I know this because I go to Princeton University, where I'm finishing up my dissertation, and I have other friends who didn't grow up young, Black, poor, and on the wrong street, but they still had a bad day, but they got a counselor instead of a cage. We got to let go of certain comforting lies and face certain terrifying facts. That 1 in every 3 Black children are growing up poor in the richest nation on earth. That climate change is expected to kill about 250,000 people a year. That almost half of all Black transgender women report being incarcerated at some point in their life. In New Jersey, right, my home state, in New Jersey, I'm right in Newark, New Jersey right now. In New Jersey, which is the last northern state to abolish slavery, by the way. Do you know what the average net worth of a white family is in my home state of New Jersey? Just guess. Just guess. Think it in your head, maybe put it in the chat. The average net worth, don't Google it. I see some of y'all Googling. I know y'all like Googling everything. Just guess. Do you know what the average net worth of a white family is? 75K. All right. The average net worth of a white family in the state of New Jersey, by the way, the last northern state to abolish slavery, is $271,402, according to one report. That's the highest in the nation. What do you think it is for the average Black family in the same state? $5,900. $271,402, $5,900. Now, we tell all types of stories to explain this disparity, this racial and economic disparity. Some people say stuff like, white Americans work harder than Black Americans, so they deserve that kind of net worth. Look at those young Black people sagging and listening to hip hop music and their messy hair. They deserve that kind of net worth. Some people say things like, white New Jerseyans must be more frugal with their money. They take care of their money more than Black people. But these stories are lies. They're lies. And I know their lives because I spent over the last decade of my life studying how racial inequality and racial injustice has worked in this country. And people who tell those stories have clearly either not studied or don't want to be honest about the history of slavery. And not just slavery, but of redlining. If you don't know what that is, please put it on your homework list. Redlining and the Federal Housing Act and the GI Bill during World War II. I don't have time to give a whole class. Maybe y'all have me back. But I'll just say really quickly that during World War II, the United States government was trying to build a middle class. The most effective way of building wealth in the United States is property ownership. So what they did was they rearranged the mortgage system so that more ordinary, average people can own homes and to enter into higher education. There were millions of soldiers who were fighting across the world. When they came back home, guess who got the GI Bill? White soldiers. Guess who did not? Over 1 million Black soldiers. And guess why they did not get it? Because they were Black. When you think about what I said, that the most effective way of building wealth in the United States of America is property ownership and access to higher education. And you have over 1 million Black people who simply because they were Black did not have access into the GI Bill. And then you fast forward to 2021, $271,402 net worth for white families, $5,900 for Black families. The story that Black folk are lazy is a lie. Our dark past, slavery and redlining, the GI Bill, Federal Housing Act, Jim Crow, lynching, it continues to shadow our present moment. Now, I promised I wouldn't harp on this, so I'm not going to talk too long about it, I promise, but I have to say it. Donald Trump is not an aberration. That is, he's not odd. He's not out of nowhere of American history. Trump is not an aberration of American history. He is an elaboration of the underside of that history. He embodies the nastiness. Now, I know we want to make him the boogeyman, but I'm just going to tell the truth. He simply embodies the nastiness of a nation that has been built on indigenous genocide and the enslavement of Africans and the colonization of Mexico, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Hawaii, and Guam, the incarceration of Japanese people in concentration camps, and the vilification of Arabs, Muslims, Jews, and immigrants from across the diaspora. Trump's election, and I'm so glad he's done. I did the electric slide that day, still kind of doing it a little bit. His election was not a departure, but rather a disclosure of what this country has always been about. I'm done. I told you I wouldn't harp on it. I'm done. These are dark times. I don't got to tell y'all. Over 450,000 people died of the novel coronavirus. Well over 1 million people worldwide. My mom owns a funeral home. I see bodies and bodies and bodies and bodies of Black folk laying on cooling boards. Some of you all may have lost someone in your family or a friend, and my heart goes out to you. But these are dark times. But I'm a preacher, so I believe that even the darkest facts can never fully eclipse the light of truth. The truth is that despite a history of injustice, we are more than the sum of our oppression. The truth is that we are not helpless victims, but we are the inheritors of a grand tradition of struggle. That amid the ashes of slavery and lynching and Jim Crow, we created the spiritual soul food and the most powerful social movements this country has ever seen. And we saw it in Minneapolis, we saw it in Portland, we saw it in Brooklyn, we saw it in 8 minutes and 42 seconds when a police officer tried to take the life of one of our brothers. People refused to let death have the last word in the midst of the merciless pandemic. So we got to tell a different story, not only of where we've been, but of where we are and where we can go. And we tell that story not merely with the words that we say, but with the lives that we lead. A different story, stories of hope, stories of resistance, stories of the power of love in the face of hate, stories that remind us that we are only here today because of the sacrifices of those who came before us. People who never lost hope and risked it all to make real the promises of democracy. If King is right, and I know y'all heard this quote before, if King is right and the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, then it only bends because people like you and I are willing to push it in the direction of freedom and justice. I just got to ask this question. I'm going to end, so I hope y'all have some questions for me, but I first have a question for you. What story is your life telling? What will people say about you when it's all said and done? Will they say you drove a nice car and graduated from prestigious universities like you're at right now? Will they say that you were eloquent but silent on the most pressing moral issues of our time? Or will they say you spoke truth to power and stood in solidarity with the most vulnerable? Will they say that you lived your life in the service of others, that you and that I struggled to make the world just a little bit better than we found it, that you and that I kept alive King's dream in the face of the deathly conditions of our cherished form of life? That's what my mother taught me. Y'all remember that little room? That's what my mother taught me and my brother in that little room next to the sun parlor. Me and my brother learned how to dream. So I believe that's what we need to do today as we protest, as we stand up, as we say no to police brutality, as we say no to economic inequality, as we say no to systems and patterns that continue to keep us cooped up, stuck right where we are. I believe that we need to dream of a world where Michael Brown, 18, unarmed Black teenager in a suburb outside of St. Louis called Ferguson, Missouri, that boy can go to college, which he was supposed to do 2 days after he was shot down on the block that he was living in. Dream of a world where Tamir Rice, 12 years old, who was playing at the park that he played at every day with a toy gun, can live to see 13 years old and can go to college like those of us on this call are able to do. Dream of a world where Muslims and Jews and Christians can live and pray in peace. A world where our queer and transgender neighbors are safe to walk the streets and use the bathrooms of their choice. A world where women are not subject to less pay for more work. A world where Black lives matter, where walls are built to house the poor and not to criminalize poverty. A world where access to clean water is a fundamental human right. A world where poverty is illegal, where you don't need money to breathe good air, to have access to good food, and to have a place to call home. I know that what I'm asking of you is impossible, James Baldwin told his nephew in 1963. I know what I am asking of you is impossible, James Baldwin told his nephew in 1963. But in our time, he said, as in every time, the impossible is the least that one can demand. Thank you so much for listening to me. I'm very excited about the Q&A.
Thank you so much. We appreciate this talk, and I see the questions coming in. But I wanted to start off with one question, Mr. Fort, and this has to do with your points you made early in your talk about MLK, because this is an MLK talk, so we're trying to engage with his thoughts, his ideologies, and his legacy. I wanted to know, I wrote here, why do you think, or why does America need a mythical king? You know, some have argued that, you know, this holiday that we observe was a way to pacify some progressive folks. So why does it need to be that mythical king that you talk about?
It's so important.
Why does he exist?
Absolutely. That's such a good question. Such a good question. I mean that. Okay, so Martin Luther King Day was made a federal holiday under a president by the name of Ronald Reagan. Okay. Martin Luther King Day was made a federal holiday under a president. Now, if y'all don't know nothing about Ronald Reagan, I highly encourage you. Our hip hop artists talk about Reaganomics all the time, the crack epidemic in the 1980s. But Ronald Reagan as a president built his entire career from being a governor of California all the way to the White House, rolling back and fighting against civil rights, precisely fighting against everything that Dr. King was fighting for. So why under Ronald Reagan's administration do we have the federalization of Dr. King's birthday. Now, part of it is because Stevie Wonder came up with the Happy Birthday song. Now, that Happy Birthday song was actually about Dr. King. There was a whole movement to push for a Dr. King's holiday. But why did they eventually embrace it? I believe that the answer to that is that King's death, King's corpse, his body, how we make meaning of that, right? It's not about the past, as I said, but it's about the future. It's about a contestation over what kind of society. So, for example, when King says, I have a dream that one day my 4 children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, that very quotation, people like Ronald Reagan and even today conservatives use that to fight against affirmative action. They say, remember what King said? You shouldn't judge people based off the color of their skin. So we shouldn't have affirmative action. And so I think it's important for certain people to have a mythical king because they understand the deep influence of Dr. King on our society. So when you pacify him, when you Santa Claus him, when you take the radical elements out of him, then you can basically keep Black folk, but all those who celebrate Dr. King exactly where we are. Don't talk about him ending the war, because then maybe us celebrating Dr. King would mean that we would have to also critique the war on terror that has spent millions and millions and billions of dollars killing folk in the Middle East and killing folk who've become soldiers here. Maybe by taking away the fact that Dr. King was pushing not just for racial justice, but eradicate poverty, then maybe now we don't, by celebrating Dr. King, we don't think about $271,402 for white families in New Jersey, $5,900, because Dr. King has just simply become a day of service. So by doing that, they're able to maintain the status quo, rather than allowing us to see that Dr. King's entire career wasn't about just planting flowers or giving out soup during soup kitchens, both of which are very important, let me be clear. But they didn't kill him because he was planting flowers or giving out soup at soup kitchens. They didn't call him the most dangerous man in America because he called for days of service. They called him the most dangerous man in America because he called for a revolution, political and spiritual. And so that's why I think we need to fight for the radical king, the historical king, the king that not only saw, racial injustice as an issue, but connected that to war, connected that to poverty, connected that to all these other issues. I believe that if King was alive today, he would not be celebrating a lot of people who's celebrating him. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. I have to agree on that, including the state of Arizona. I was a kid when Public Enemy came out. By the time I get to Arizona, the song that spoke to the fact that that was the last state to agree to the federal holiday. There are a few questions here, but let's stick to MLK's philosophies for a minute. So Greg asked this question: over the last year, I've heard too many predominantly white Americans criticize Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolent action. They'll say, quote, MLK took nonviolence too far, end quote, as though the philosophy of nonviolence is a matter of degree. Can you speak to the courage and strength of Dr. King's nonviolent action?
Absolutely. There's a book called This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. So I would start there. Check that book out. I'm not an expert on most of the things you're asking me, but what I do have is resources. So we're all students, so I encourage us to grapple with these questions. I'll just try to provide some insight. So check that book out. This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. Sometimes nonviolence is seen as like you're a punk or something like that. Like you don't have courage. But it takes a deep amount of courage that in the face of violence, to have nonviolent direct action. So nonviolent can be seen in different ways. Oftentimes it's described as some kind of passive thing. That's not what Dr. King was talking about. That's not what Fannie Lou Hamer was talking about. That's not what the folks in the civil rights movement were talking about. They were talking about nonviolent resistance, nonviolent direct action. They weren't talking about staying home. They were talking about go out on the streets and actually confronting Bull Connor and police who had hoses, who were hosing down 8 and 9-year-olds. That's what they were talking about. So I also want to take a step back. So Dr. King did not believe in nonviolence at first. He only believed in nonviolence strategically. So he didn't think that we would win by being violent. He just said, I don't think it's going to work. We don't have enough guns. We don't have an army. I think that they will win every time and there'll be a bloodbath. So at first, he was only strategically nonviolent. He didn't become spiritually nonviolent until a queer Black man who was also a Quaker by the name of Bayard Rustin convinced him. So Bayard Rustin went to King's house. This is the legend. He went to King's house and he had to move through armed guards to get inside. Because remember, people were trying to kill King, bombed his house, all this stuff. He wanted to protect himself. He wanted to protect his family, right? And so Bayard Rustin had to walk through armed guards to get in to convince Dr. King of spiritual nonviolence. He sat down at the table with him. And it was through that conversation that he began to open up Dr. King's mind to embrace spiritual nonviolence. And so I think it's very important to see nonviolence as an important tactic. But I also think it's important to recognize that Black folks have options. I don't think it's helpful for us to think about nonviolent resistance versus violence. Oftentimes that violence actually is about self-defense. It's not necessarily about violence, it's about the dignity of defending oneself and one's loved ones in the face of actual violence, right? So I think it's important. That's that stale story we tell about Malcolm X being a violent person and the Black Panther Party being these gun-toting ghetto Black kids in the hood who just hate cops. And then you got these sort of real soft ministers like Dr. King. That's just simply not true. The Black Panther Party, for example, they had a gun in one hand, but they had a law book in the other. They were one of the beginning people to police the police. They were reading Frantz Fanon and Mao and all of these folks because they were deeply engaging in political struggle. They also came up with the Free Breakfast for Children program, which the government eventually adopted. We wouldn't have probably free breakfast for children if it wasn't for the Black Panther Party. They created an ambulance system because the ambulance weren't coming to Black communities on time. So they say, you know what? We're gonna pick you up and take you to the hospital. Okay, so they have all of these other things, but when we push them off the table altogether because they express self-defense, then we lose all these other components. So what I want to emphasize is that there are a variety of ways, in my opinion, to resist injustice. And I think that we need to study, we need to grapple, and we need to come together to understand how to make the world a better place.
Thank you, Mr. Fort.
Thank you.
Now, Michelle and Nick had similar questions, so I'll tie their questions together. In terms of action steps, what are your primary recommendations on an individual level, collectively as groups, or on an institutional level, depending on what institutions, maybe starting with the idea of what universities might do?
Yeah, So let me try. I might not do it exactly the way I'm being asked, but let me try. So three things. One is, let me give an analogy. So when my car breaks down, and it does too much, when my car breaks down, if it's not an oil change, I ran out of gas, or a flat tire, I have no idea what to do. I had to call a mechanic immediately, like, yo, my car broke down, please come get somebody to tow it. You go look at it. Why? Because the mechanic has been trained to understand the car. I haven't. I just know it's broke. That's all. I just know there's something wrong with it. It ain't driving, right? So let's think about American society like a car, okay? The car is just breaking down all the time. And when it's not breaking down, it's running people over, it's harming communities, it's just out of control. It looks really nice on the outside. It got a nice paint job, the tires look shiny, but it's causing and wreaking havoc, especially in the most vulnerable communities. So why do I say this? I say this because if we don't understand what's going on underneath the hood, then we could know that it's wrong, that it keeps breaking down, but we don't know what to do about it. We need mechanics, social, political mechanics to understand what's going on with this car. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that actually, I know that protest is important. I'm gonna get to that actually right after this, but we actually have to study and understand society because you can't fix a problem that you don't understand. And the problem, I'm telling you, is not as easy as it seems, like it's a chip on the paint or just simply the gas running out or you need an oil change. It's much deeper than that. So we have to study, we have to understand. I've spent over the last 10 years of my life trying to figure out this car. And I won't tell you how to diagnose the car, but I will encourage you to figure out how to do it. In my diagnosis, and I won't give it all away, but in my diagnosis, when I pop the hood of American society and I look at what's underneath, what I see is not that the car is messed up, right? But that it was built that way. It's a defected car by nature. And this happens with cars sometimes, right? They recall them. They recall them because there's nothing you can do. You can't change the engine. You can't do, it's defected by nature. That's my diagnosis of American society. I don't want you to adopt mine, but I want you to begin to think about what does it mean to be a social and political and a moral mechanic on our society. So study, read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, read Robin D.G. Kelly's Freedom Dreams, read my advisor, Eddie Glaude's Begin Again, read my other advisor, Imani Perry's Breathe, A Letter to Her Sons, watch the PBS documentary, Race, The Power of an Illusion. There's so many examples, and maybe afterwards I can give more resources. So let's start with fixing the car, political education, and don't just limit that to what you learn in class. 2 is protest. Now, protest gets a lot of bad rap sometimes. What y'all out there, y'all just protesting. We need to know what you really want, right? Okay, so I want to speak to that real quick. If you have African-American studies on your campus, which we do at Princeton, you only have it on your campus because students in the 1960s, 1967, 1968, 1969 protested on their campuses. They shut down presidents' offices, right? They went out on campus on the yard and they demanded African-American studies. Students in San Francisco State, students across the country demanded, so we would not have the opportunity to even study African-American studies if there were not for students who decided to protest. We celebrate the 1954 Brown versus Board. We celebrate the 1964 and 1965 Voting and Civil Rights Acts, right? Those were only made possible because of the protest of Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement and the 1960s movements more generally. So even the legislation that we celebrate today, like affirmative action and all these other things, they only came about because people hit the streets. So I really much affirm protest, and you can do that on your college campus. You can do that in your local community. You can do that in so many different ways and around so many different issues. I talked about climate change. I talked about the fact that women get less pay for more work. That's sexism, that's patriarchy in the workplace. I talked about transgender lives. There's so many different things that I can talk about. And so think about, what do I want my community to look like? What do I want my campus to look like? And what do I need to do? So 1, social, political, moral mechanics, let's study. 2, let's protest. And 3, we can't just stop there. We have to build and join social movements. And you are growing up in one of the most remarkable social movements this country has ever seen, called the Movement for Black Lives, in all of its flaws, but it's still wonderful. And that movement comes on the heels of so many movements. So how did slavery end? It didn't end because Abraham Lincoln woke up one morning with a change of heart and said, oh man, I feel bad what we've been doing to these Black enslaved people for the last hundreds of years. No, there was an abolition movement that ended and broke the back of slavery, right? The KKK didn't stop lynching people because they felt like it, because they went to church one day. No, W.E.B. Du Bois was arguing against lynching in the courts. Ida B. Wells was journaling about anti-lynching in the papers. And you had family members who were protecting their loved ones and who were fighting back against lynching. It was an anti-lynching movement that broke the back of lynching. Jim Crow, the politicians and the police chiefs didn't say, oh man, we should let them drink at the same water fountain and sit at the same lunch counters. No, there were students in North Carolina who said, I'm sitting at the counter anyway. And they were arrested and they were beaten so that now we can bear the fruits of what they planted. So just like before, same with today. How are we gonna free 2 million people in our prisons, almost 1 million whom are Black? A movement. How are we going to protect our, most vulnerable in our communities who don't have the money when they get sick to buy the medicine to keep them alive? A movement. And so I just encourage you, let's study, let's protest, and let's join movements.
Thank you, Mr. Fort. And I think with that in mind, you sort of answered Dr. Randolph Brooks' question, which was, is it possible for the movement to move forward without centralized leadership? Or should we work independently with the same goals in mind? I think that's a question a lot of people have around individual work they could do, and to what extent they need to join forces with other folks to make change happen.
That's a great question. I mean, that's a question that those of us who've been engaged in this latest iteration of the Black freedom struggle, Black Lives Matter, have been arguing and debating and strategizing around for the last 6 years, 7 years actually. And so I love the question because it also gets past this idea that, this very simple idea that all we do is protest. We actually, I mean, when I was in Ferguson, we spent more hours in rooms debating, how can we get free than we did out in the streets in front of the police department. But MSNBC and CNN and Fox don't tell you that. So I love the question. I don't have, okay. So I think democracy is very important, not just in terms of how we fight externally, but how we move about internally. Meaning, I think that we have to be very careful when we let a small group of people determine a very broad movement and the interests and desires and the needs of most people. That is to say, I'm not saying that central leadership per se is a bad thing, but I think if we go about doing that, we have to be very sensitive towards how that can easily fall into an anti-democratic sensibility, a practice of we then, us 5 or us 7 or us 10 get to decide. One of the ways I've seen that addressed in groups like the Dream Defenders or Black Youth Project 100 is that they have rotating chairs. So one, they have 2 chairs, so they have a co-chair. 2 chairs instead of one person leading it, they'll have 2. And those people can't stay in office forever. They stay in office for 1 to 2 years. And they are supposed to be accountable to the body of the membership. So that's an example where you actually have multiple organizations. No one controls everyone, but you have multiple organizations that have a mixture of centralized leadership with also this kind of horizontal activity, and the two come together. There's also people who believe in what they call leaderless movements. I have some issues with that because I actually think that all of us are leaders. I believe in what Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer was talking about, that we are the leaders we've been looking for. But I think it looks different on different contexts. In Newark, for example, there's not a lot happening. So me and my co-chair of my local organization, we have had to sort of step up and do more of the work than we'd like to, because in Newark, there's a ton of people right now. And so it looks differently in different contexts. But what I will say is try as best as you can to practice democracy internally as we fight for it externally.
Thank you. And I think it's good for us to think in these broad terms around how we can work as a larger community that's part of an institutional organization. But Zoe had a really, really good question that's about our intra-racial responses to these kinds of things. What are some strategies to practice when trying to educate others, our brothers and sisters, Black folks, who are less informed on our own history? Because that's a separate conversation, right, than the overall activism. We're doing the work within in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's, whew, man, y'all, these are such easy questions, y'all. I mean, come on. Y'all gonna have to have me back with all these great questions. I talked about the Black Panther Party. And I love I think they get such a bad rap, but I think in all their flaws, and they've had many, they were a remarkable formation to me that needs to be studied and in certain ways carried on. So I talked about the Free Breakfast for Children program. So the Black Panther Party was like, we could knock on doors and be like, look, Frantz Fanon wrote this book called The Wretched of the Earth, and Chairman Mao out in China, talked about revolution. Are you gonna get on board? Like evangelists almost. Nothing wrong with evangelists, but I'm just saying that they could have done that. They said, no, there are needs to be met in Black communities, okay? We are gonna meet those needs, and we're gonna meet those needs, one, because we love Black people, regardless of what their political views are. We deeply love Black people. I can't stand some Black people, but I love them. They in my family, y'all. They in my family. I can't stand them, but I love them deeply, right? So the Black Panther Party had a deep abiding love for Black people, and they realized that part of what that love meant was meeting the needs of the people in their community. Now, what's dope about the Black Panther Party is they connected community service, that is breakfast for children in the morning, because they were like, how are babies gonna learn if they're hungry? These ambulance program, all these other things that they had going on, they connected that with politics. So when they were feeding the children, they were also teaching them about socialism. So what that did was it created a relationship between them and the community where the mothers, I mean, if they didn't understand socialism, they appreciated that they could drop their baby off at 5:36 in the morning and get eggs and bacon. So that built a certain relationship where the community began to trust them. Because at first it was like, who is these kids with guns? So they begin to trust them. And through that trust, they begin to learn together and begin to transform certain communities. So I love their model of connecting community service, because some churches do a great job, but a lot of times people who do community service, they don't have the revolutionary or the radical politics we need. The soup kitchens, the churches, these types of things. Now, some of them do, and more of them need to. But I think that we can actually meet those needs and also promote those politics. I think another one is to recognize that sometimes people have the politics, they're just not explicit or they're not formalized. So there's a whole conversation about police abolition right now, where people are trying to think about how can we have safety in our communities without police, or where we can get at least defunding, where a lot of the budgets, like in Chicago, almost 50% of the budget was going towards police, while 50 public schools were being shut down. That's ridiculous. If money talks, then that should tell us everything about the moral nature of that city. But some people are saying, look, we can teach people abolition, or we can recognize that it already exists in hip hop music. So when people say free my, free such and such, they didn't say, well, keep them in because of this violent action, or they said free them. Now they might not connect that with a politics of defunding the police or a politics of abolishing the police, but there's something in there that makes them feel, it's not that I don't care what the person did, but I understand that the broader society is actually writing the script and they're just a character in it. And so I think it's also about teasing out, meeting people right where they are, so that we can also sort of do this thing together. It's too helpful.
Thank you, thank you. Now I have a question. There's a couple more questions from the audience, but I have one that I have to ask you that is so important to me. There's some things you said that made me think about this. So you're finishing up your dissertation now at Princeton. So we're two Black academics. I'm thinking back to a few months ago when there was this controversy among some of us Black folk around Ice Cube meeting with the Trump administration to talk about this platinum plan. And folks were saying, there was this debate took place on my Facebook page about who are mechanics. I'm thinking about you saying mechanics. Who are our mechanics? Because some folks think of people like us. We grew up poor. Now we're professors, we're academics, that we no longer have the right to have a particular kind of voice because that voice is elitist. And I'm not saying anything against Ice Cube. I think he's an amazing rapper, business person. He's done well in Hollywood, but is he necessarily the best person to make that presentation to an administration such as that of Trump? So my question is, what role does the university and the Ivy Tower, and more specifically academics and Black academics, play in trying to negotiate all this? Are we too high up in our Ivy Tower? What role do you think we play? I have my own ideas, but I'm curious to have you respond to that.
I would love to hear yours. Well, in terms of the elitist thing, then we shouldn't celebrate Dr. King if that's the case. Dr. King came from a very comfortable family. His daddy he was the man in Atlanta. And so he came from a very solidly middle-class upbringing. And so if we want to get rid of people who are middle class or upper middle class or even elite, let's get rid of Dr. King. Let's get rid of Du Bois. Let's get rid of Ella Baker. She went to college, HBCU. I went to Morehouse, by the way. Shout out to all the HBCU people. So I think that is an idea that we probably need to interrogate and help people understand that some of our most remarkable freedom fighters, they were across the class spectrum. Some were very poor. Some actually came from much means, and a lot were in between. Stokely Carmichael did not grow up poor, okay? So there's all these different people, and our identities don't determine our ideas. So there are some people who grow up poor who are anti-poor. There are some people who are queer who are homophobic, right? So your identity doesn't necessarily tell you everything about someone's politics. I think we need to be really careful and suspicious of those types of narratives. I think that universities, by and large, are more a part of the problem than the solution. By and large, I'm not saying your university, but Princeton is. These Ivy League schools are. I mean, for sure, they are more. They are one of the biggest managers of social inequality in the world. They literally produce social inequality. At Princeton, one stat says 1 in every 3 undergrads were legacy students, meaning one of their parents went to Princeton. You know what that means? That means that they are just managing social inequality. They used to call it the Ivy of the South. They called it the Ivy of the South because that's where slave masters would send their boys to become good slave masters. right? So we're standing in that history. So I think that the university, by and large, not every university, but by and large, the institution of academia is more a part of the problem than the solution. I think those of us who are in academia, whether you're an undergrad student, whether you're an administrator, whether you are a PhD student, whether you're a professor, the best we could do is take the resources of the university. So what universities do have, they have rooms, they have theaters, they have money, they have classrooms, they have students, they have all of these resources that can be used to promote and to fight for social justice. So there's a dope book called The Undercommons, which was written by Fred Moten and Stefano Harvey. It's a really dense book, but at the end, they have an interview that's a little bit more accessible. And in that, I'm getting this essentially from them. They're arguing that there's an undercommons to the university, that there's a marginal space, however oppressive it can be, however unjust it can be. Interestingly, the university is actually one of the last institutions in American society where you can still write about Karl Marx and, not get looked. So I would say that we need to take the resources of the university. So for example, when I teach classes, anybody can come to my class. Ain't nobody checking for me. Anybody can come to my class. I've taken my late brother, to my classes before. I didn't ask anybody. I just brought him. That's open admissions. Now, I can't practice open admissions on the university level because I'm not the president and I'm not a trustee, but I could practice this in my classroom. You feel me? So I would say I've organized conferences. And when I organize conferences, I've given the money, not just to the panelists, but to local communities, to community-based organizations and things like that. So take the resources of the university as we try to transform it. Let's make sure that we're using that to transform our communities.
Thank you so much. And I have 3 more questions here, but we only have time for one. And this last question I purposefully saved for last, and it was actually the first question that was asked. And this question comes from Dr. Tricia Lynn, who is the director of our Women's and Gender Studies program, and she's also former president of the National Women's Studies Association. And what she wants to know is, what kind of ancestor do you want to be, Mr. Fort, soon to be Dr. Fort?
Wow, I've never gotten a question like that. Wow, it's a question that I'm sure I'm going to go back and say, I wish I would have said this, and this, but it's a question that I'm probably going to meditate on. What kind of ancestor do I want to be? I want to be one that is a part of a community. I don't believe in celebrity activists. I think it's really dangerous to uplift people. We're talking about Dr. King on Dr. King Day. And a lot of times the problem is that we don't understand that King didn't make a movement made King. And when we buy into this idea of charismatic leadership, oftentimes back then it was Black, cisgender, heterosexual men from religious institutions. You had all the ministers, Dr. King, you had Malcolm and the Nation of Islam. I want to be an ancestor that's deeply a part of a broader movement, and I want to play my role at the highest level. Whatever gifts I have, whether it's preaching and speaking, whether it's scholar activism, whether it's my ministry, what cultural work, whatever my gifts are as they evolve over time, I want to do that at the highest level in community with other people. And I'll say this, I want to bring joy to the struggle. And I didn't get a chance to talk about, all the music I listened to. I didn't get a chance to talk about the fact that I love theater. I didn't get a chance to talk about my living room right here and all my friends that I have over. And sometimes we don't talk about oppression or activism. It's about bringing joy to the struggle, making folks smile, that feeling, that quality of spirit that's not reducible to the things that I said. But that's everything about the deep love that I have for Black people and all oppressed people. And even though I can't stand some of these folks, all people across the world. I want to be known for that deep, abiding love that was produced through a village and a community, like my mama, like my late father, like my late brother, like so many in my community, like those folks in the Pentecostal church I grew up with who had bad theology, but they gave me peppermints and money to go to the Chinese food store and put all this hot sauce and ketchup on my chicken. So I want to be a deep, abiding love ancestor that did my work at the highest level.
Thank you so much. There's so many questions still coming in, but I think it's time to wrap it up. And yes, Ms. Brown-Albert, you ready to close out?
All right. Wow. Mr. Fort, Dr. Carter, amazing, powerful. What I say to our audience, it's definitely, yes, also Black History Month. You have shared so much resource and names. Some of the folks you named, I just wanted to share to our audience that if you don't know these names, you better make sure you look them up. You shared Ida B. Wells, Baynard Rustin, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer. There's so many different things and resources you shared, and your thoughts, your comments. I hope that everyone who's listening really understood where you were coming from, and take your message and follow Dr. King in terms of what are you doing to make sure that dream is uplifted and moving forward. You know, what service are you doing? What are you doing for others? And I hope they continue to make sure that Black History Month, as well as Dr. King's Day, is not just one day, but it's all year long and something that we live by. On behalf of Southern Connecticut State University, we want to say thank you. And because there's still so many more questions, we'll look again to make sure that you come back to visit us. Thank you, Dr. Carter. For everyone else, I want to share that we do have other events coming up for Black History Month from the campus, so look out. Some things that are coming up, make sure you mark your calendar. We have Black Mental Health Matters, which is Wednesday, February 17th. It's a virtual event by the counseling office. We also have the Black History Month Luncheon, which is February 18th at 11:30. There's a movie screening of Out in the Night on February 22nd, but there's a lot more on the Black History Month calendar, so take a look and join us. On behalf of the university and the Multicultural Center, a special thank you to our guests again. And I just want to say, may the memory of Dr. King continue to inspire us and elevate our world and everyone who lives in it. So keep the dream alive, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Y'all take care.